At 10:48 on the evening of Tuesday, September 18th, 1877, station agent John Barnhart heard the creak of floorboards behind him in the depot at Big Springs, Nebraska. He turned from his telegraph key to find 4 revolvers aimed at his face, 2 men with a gun in each hand. The barrels caught the lamplight. One of the masked men spoke quietly, almost apologetically, and told Barnhart to destroy the telegraph. Barnhart reached for the sounder, the clicking device that received messages, thinking he could fool them into believing the line was dead. The second man's voice cut through the small room like a saw blade. "Hold on there, that won't do. We don't want any damned foolishness in this business." Barnhart looked at the revolvers again and obeyed. He pulled the wires from the telegraph instrument until the connection to Omaha, 361 miles east, went silent. The station was not a town. It was a water stop on the Union Pacific Main Line where steam locomotives paused to fill their boilers from a spring that had served wagon trains on the Oregon Trail for decades. There was the depot, a water tank, Barnhart's small house, and quarters for the section hands who maintained the track. Beyond that stretched the Nebraska prairie, flat and treeless except for one ancient cottonwood growing north of the South Platte River. At this hour, the only sounds were wind in the grass and the distant call of a coyote. The 2 gunmen ordered Barnhart outside. 2 more masked men waited by the tracks. Barnhart was told to hang the red lantern and the mailbag on the signal post. The red light would tell the engineer to stop. The mailbag was the excuse. Every eastbound train stopped at Big Springs to collect the mail. Union Pacific Express train number 4 was running on schedule from San Francisco, carrying passengers and cargo toward Chicago. In the express car rode wooden crates marked for Wells, Fargo and Company in New York and for the New York Bank of Commerce. Inside those crates, packed in sawdust, sat 3,000 freshly minted $20 gold pieces, each one stamped at the San Francisco Mint that summer. The coins had never been in circulation. They weighed $60,000 in gold, equivalent to $1.7 million in purchasing power by the standards of 2020. The shipment was routine. Since the completion of the Transcontinental Railroad in 1869, California gold had traveled east by rail every month, moving through small stations like Big Springs in the deep hours between sunset and dawn when few witnesses were awake to see it pass. The robbery at Big Springs was the largest single theft in the history of the Union Pacific Railroad. It was executed by 6 men who had spent the previous year robbing stagecoaches in the Black Hills of South Dakota and had killed at least 1 man in the process. They called themselves nothing, but the newspapers named them the Black Hills Bandits after their first crimes. Their leader was not Sam Bass, though history would remember Bass most clearly. The leader was Joel Collins, a Texan 7 years older than Bass, who had planned the operation and recruited the men. The gang had come south from Deadwood to the rail line, specifically to rob a train, because stagecoach hold-ups paid too little when the take was divided 6 ways. They had researched the Union Pacific schedule, studied the layout of Big Springs, and learned that eastbound express trains carried payroll and valuables that westbound trains did not. On the evening of September 18th, they rode into position with a pack mule and waited in the darkness for the red lantern to summon the locomotive. The Civil War had ended 12 years earlier. Reconstruction had officially concluded in the southern states just 4 months before, in May 1877, when federal troops withdrew from Louisiana, South Carolina, and Florida. The nation was still finding its shape. In the West, violence between settlers and indigenous peoples continued despite the defeat of the Lakota and Cheyenne forces at the Little Bighorn the previous summer, and the subsequent dispossession of the Black Hills under duress. The Transcontinental Railroad had been completed for 8 years, but rail travel remained a rough and sometimes dangerous enterprise. Banditry along the rail lines was common enough that express companies employed armed guards, though not on every train. Train number 4 carried no guards that night. The railroad assumed that small stations in the middle of nowhere posed little risk. The Union Pacific had been built between 1863 and 1869 as the eastern half of the transcontinental line, running from Council Bluffs, Iowa, to Promontory Summit, Utah, where it met the Central Pacific coming east from Sacramento. The line transformed the American West from a series of isolated territories into an integrated economic system. Gold and silver from California and Nevada mines moved east by train. Manufactured goods from eastern factories moved west. Passengers who once took 7 months to travel around Cape Horn by ship now made the journey in 7 days. The railroad also carried another kind of cargo, invisible in the ledgers but critical to the economy: information. Telegraph lines ran parallel to the tracks. News, market prices, orders, and payroll instructions traveled at the speed of electricity. When the Outlaws cut the telegraph at Big Springs, they severed not just a wire, but a nerve connecting the railroad to its central command in Omaha. The 6 men who committed the robbery had not started as career criminals. Sam Bass was 26 years old in September 1877. He had been born in Mitchell, Indiana, on July 21, 1851, the son of Daniel and Elizabeth Bass. Both his parents died before he turned 14. He was raised by an uncle who beat him, and he left home at 19, drifting south to work in a sawmill in Rosedale, Mississippi, before moving west to North Texas. In Denton County, he worked as a ranch hand for Sheriff William Everhart, building fences and caring for livestock. He also hauled freight for the railroad, loading goods onto cars that traveled between Denton, Dallas, and Sherman. By all accounts, Bass was a competent worker and an honest young man until he acquired a racehorse, a small sorrel mare that became known as the Denton mare. He began racing her on Saturdays and winning. The gambling that accompanied the races consumed his time and money. Sheriff Everhart warned him to sell the horse or lose his job. Bass quit. Joel Collins was older, born around 1844 or 1845, and had more experience with cattle and frontier life. He and Bass met in the San Antonio area in 1874, likely through mutual connections in the livestock trade. In the summer of 1876, they contracted to drive a herd of longhorn cattle north from Texas to the railhead markets in Nebraska. The drive took months, following the trail through Indian Territory and Kansas to Ogallala, Nebraska, a cattle town on the Union Pacific line. They sold the herd for $8,000, but instead of returning the money to the ranchers who had hired them, they kept it and continued north to Deadwood, in the Dakota Territory, where gold had been discovered in 1874. The Black Hills gold rush was at its peak. Deadwood had perhaps 10 saloons for every church. Collins and Bass spent their $8,000 in the gambling halls and brothels within a matter of weeks. By the fall of 1876, Collins and Bass were broke. They tried to work as freighters, hauling supplies between mining camps, but made little money. They recruited 4 other men who were similarly stranded and desperate. Jack Davis had built a brothel in Deadwood. Tom Nixon, Bill Heffridge, and Jim Berry were drifters, though Berry came from a settled family in Missouri and Nixon may have had ties to Canada. Together, the 6 men turned to robbing stagecoaches. Between late 1876 and the spring of 1877, they held up 7 stages in the Deadwood area, targeting the Cheyenne to Deadwood line. 4 of those robberies were on the same stage route. The holdups were not sophisticated. They stopped the coaches at gunpoint, took what the passengers carried, and vanished into the hills. On March 25, 1877, during their 5th holdup attempt, they killed a stage driver named Johnny Slaughter. The murder escalated the stakes. Up to that point, they had been thieves. After Slaughter's death, they were killers, and the law pursued them with more intensity. The stagecoach robberies netted them a few $100s per job, divided 6 ways. Collins calculated that they would need a larger score to escape the Black Hills with enough money to start over. Trains carried more passengers than stages, and express cars carried payrolls, bank shipments, and bonded cargo. In the summer of 1877, Collins and the gang drifted south from Deadwood to Ogallala, the cattle town where Collins and Bass had sold their stolen herd the previous year. Ogallala sat on the Union Pacific Main Line, and the gang used it as a base to study the railroad's operations. They learned the schedule of express trains, identified which trains carried valuables, and chose Big Springs as the target because it was isolated and lightly defended. They rode out to Big Springs on September 18th with the pack mule and their plan. When Train No. 4's engineer saw the red lantern at Big Springs, he brought the locomotive to a halt. Steam hissed from the boiler as the train settled on the rails. The conductor stepped down to collect the mail bag. Instead, he found masked men with revolvers ordering him back aboard. The 6 outlaws boarded the train, 3 entering the express car and 3 moving through the passenger cars. In the express car, they found the messenger, a man whose name is not preserved in the records, but who was responsible for guarding the cargo. The outlaws demanded he open the safe. He said it had a time lock and could not be opened until the train reached its eastern terminus. One of the outlaws began beating him over the head with the barrel of a revolver, accusing him of lying. Sam Bass, according to later testimony, intervened and told the man to stop, saying he believed the messenger was telling the truth. The beating continued until the messenger's face was covered in blood, but the safe remained locked. While the violence played out in the express car, the other outlaws were searching. They found a small-away safe used for storing passengers' items and mail. It contained $450. Then they found the wooden crates. The crates were heavy, stacked near the main safe, unmarked except for shipping labels. One of the outlaws pried open a crate with an axe. Inside were rows of $20 gold pieces, each coin gleaming in the lamplight, packed so tightly they barely shifted when the crate was tilted. The outlaws called to each other. They had found something far beyond what they had imagined. They loaded the gold into sacks and carried it off the train. In the passenger cars, the other 3 outlaws moved through the aisles demanding money and watches. They took $1,300 and 4 gold watches from the passengers. The robbery lasted less than 30 minutes. At 11:15, the outlaws rode away from Big Springs with $61,750 in gold, cash, and goods. Behind them, the train resumed its journey, carrying passengers who would tell the story in Omaha and Chicago and New York, and a battered messenger who would testify later that he thought he was going to die. The outlaws also left behind cargo they could not carry. In the express car were 535 silver bars, each weighing 100 pounds, valued at a total of $682,476. The bars were too heavy to load onto horses. The gang had to choose between mobility and maximum wealth. They chose mobility, which suggests they understood that speed was now their only advantage. They rode north from Big Springs to the Lone Tree, the solitary cottonwood that stood on the north side of the South Platte River. There they divided the $60,000 in gold 6 ways, each man receiving $10,000 in $20 pieces. $10,000 was more than a working man in 1877 could expect to earn in 10 years. It was more than the annual salary of most professionals. It was enough to buy land, start a business, or disappear into another life. The division of the loot under the Lone Tree became part of the legend, repeated in newspaper accounts and dime novels for decades afterward. The tree itself was a landmark, known to travelers for years before the robbery. It had served as a beacon for emigrants on the Oregon and California trails, a rare vertical feature on a landscape that stretched flat in every direction. The Pony Express had used it as a reference point. The Union Pacific had established the water station at Big Springs, partly because of the spring, but the Lone Tree reinforced the location's identity. After the robbery, the tree became a symbol of the crime, and eventually it was cut down, though the exact date is not recorded. By the early 20th century, no trace of it remained except in photographs and in the memories of people who had seen it when it still stood. After dividing the money, the gang split into 3 pairs and rode in different directions. This was a calculated decision. A posse tracking 6 men together could follow the trail easily. 3 pairs riding separately in different directions would force the pursuers to split up or choose which trail to follow, reducing the chance that all 6 men would be caught. Joel Collins and Bill Heffridge rode southwest toward Kansas. Jim Barry and Tom Nixon rode east toward Missouri. Sam Bass and Jack Davis rode south toward Texas in a one-horse buggy, disguised as farmers with the gold hidden under the seat. The plan was sound in theory, but it assumed the gang members would remain disciplined and avoid drawing attention to themselves. That assumption would prove fatally wrong. Within hours of the robbery, telegraph messages went out from the next station down the line, summoning law enforcement from across Nebraska and neighboring states. The Union Pacific Railroad posted a $10,000 reward for the capture of the robbers. Local sheriffs, railroad detectives, private citizens hoping for the reward, and eventually U.S. Army detachments began searching the area around Big Springs. The problem was that no one knew who the robbers were, how many there had been, or which direction they had gone. The gang had worn masks during the robbery. John Barnhart, the station agent, could provide some physical descriptions, but he had seen only 4 of the 6 men and could not identify any of them by name. The passengers on the train had seen the robbers' clothing and heard their voices, but that was not enough to generate leads. The breakthrough came from a Union Pacific detective named E.M. Leach, a 27-year-old investigator who had previously worked tracking moonshiners in Tennessee. Leach had taken it upon himself to survey the crime scene at Big Springs before he was officially hired by the railroad. He knew the region from hunting trips and had contacts among the local population. When the railroad superintendent, E.M. Mooresman, met Leach, he was impressed by the detective's initiative and local knowledge. Leach began tracking the gang by following their trail from Big Springs to a camp on the Republican River, a few miles from the Nebraska-Kansas border. He was 24 hours behind them, but the trail was clear because all 6 men had initially ridden together before splitting up. Leach covered 60 miles in one day on horseback and found the abandoned camp late at night on September 22nd, 4 days after the robbery. The gang had already divided the loot and separated, but Leach found evidence that helped him identify them. Leach's work was aided by a detail the gang had overlooked. Before the robbery, they had ridden into Ogallala to buy supplies. A shopkeeper named Leach, not related to the detective, had sold them provisions and had noticed them because they paid in cash and bought quantities that suggested they were planning a long journey. One of them, Joel Collins, had bought a pair of new boots from Leach's store. Leach had sold those boots on behalf of Jim Barry, and he recognized the distinctive boot print left at the gang's campsite. Leach also found a piece of a handkerchief at the campsite and traced it back to the same store in Ogallala. With these clues, Leach identified 4 of the 6 gang members: Joel Collins, Jim Barry, Sam Bass, and Bill Heffridge, who sometimes used the alias Bill Potts. Leach telegraphed this information to law enforcement agencies across the region, and the manhunt intensified. On September 26th, 8 days after the robbery, Joel Collins and Bill Heffridge rode into Buffalo Station, a small settlement on the Kansas Pacific Railroad in northwestern Kansas, now the town of Gove. They were tired, their horses were exhausted, and they made the mistake of lingering too long in the town's general store. The railroad agent at Buffalo Station had received the telegraph messages about the robbery and the descriptions of the suspects. He recognized Collins and Heffridge and alerted Sheriff George Bardsley of Ellis County. Bardsley assembled a posse that included 10 soldiers from a nearby U.S. Army detachment, commanded by Corporal William Eddy. When Bardsley and his men confronted Collins and Heffridge, the outlaws either drew their weapons or attempted to flee. The accounts differ on the exact sequence, but the outcome was certain. Bardsley shot and killed Collins. A soldier rode up behind Heffridge and shot him dead. The confrontation lasted seconds. The posse searched the bodies and recovered $19,456.67 in gold coins. 2 of the 6 robbers were dead. 4 were still at large. Jim Berry and Tom Nixon had ridden east from Big Springs toward Missouri. Berry came from Mexico, Missouri, a town about 100 miles northwest of St. Louis, and he made the mistake of returning home. On October 5th, Berry and Nixon stepped off a train in Mexico. Nixon immediately boarded another train heading for Chicago and disappeared from history. Whether he made it to Canada, as some accounts suggest, or simply vanished into the anonymity of a large city, no one knows. Berry stayed in Mexico and began spending money. He bought clothing, paid debts, and behaved in a manner that attracted the attention of local authorities. On October 13th, Sheriff Harry Glasscock of Audrain County confronted Berry. A gunfight erupted. Glasscock shot Berry in the left leg with buckshot. Berry fled but collapsed from blood loss. He was captured and taken to a doctor, but gangrene set in from the buckshot wounds. Berry died on October 16th, 28 days after the robbery. The posse found $2,768 on his body. 3 of the 6 robbers were now dead. 3 remained. Tom Nixon's disappearance is one of the enduring mysteries of the case. Some accounts claim he carried $10,000 when he left Missouri, which would be his full share from the robbery. If true, Nixon managed to escape with his entire haul and live out his life in anonymity, which would make him the only member of the gang to achieve a complete success. Other accounts suggest he may have been killed later under a different name, but no evidence confirms this. By late October 1877, law enforcement agencies had recovered approximately $22,000 from the bodies of Collins, Heffridge, and Berry. That left roughly $38,000 unaccounted for, presumably in the hands of Nixon, Bass, and Davis. Sam Bass and Jack Davis had taken the longest and most circuitous route back to Texas. Traveling in a one-horse buggy with the gold hidden under the seat, they posed as farmers and avoided main roads when possible. According to later accounts, they encountered a group of soldiers and detectives who were searching for the train robbers. Bass and Davis convinced the soldiers that they too were searching for the bandits in hopes of collecting the reward. They traveled with the soldiers for 4 days before parting ways and continuing south. The deception worked because no one yet knew what Bass and Davis looked like, and their disguise as simple farmers seemed plausible. They reached Denton, Texas in late October or early November 1877. Bass explained his sudden wealth by claiming he had struck gold in the Black Hills. Given that the Black Hills gold rush was still in progress and many prospectors were returning to Texas, with varying degrees of success, the story was believable enough that it did not immediately raise suspicion. The question that haunted investigators and later historians was what Sam Bass did with his $10,000 in gold. By February 1878, just 4 months after returning to Denton, Bass was robbing trains again in Texas. If he had $10,000, which was a fortune, why would he return to crime so quickly? Several theories emerged. One was that Bass had a gambling addiction and lost the money at poker tables and racetracks in Denton and surrounding towns. Another theory, less documented but persistent in local folklore, was that Bass buried the gold somewhere near Denton and never spent it at all. Proponents of this theory argued that Bass robbed trains not for money, but for the thrill and the notoriety, a psychological compulsion rather than an economic necessity. The truth remains unknown. What is certain is that Bass formed a new gang in early 1878 and began a string of train robberies in North Texas that would make him famous and ultimately get him killed. Bass's new gang included several men: Henry Underwood, Arkansas Johnson, Jim Murphy, Frank Jackson, Sam Pipes, Albert Herndon, and Seaborn Barnes. Most of them were drifters, petty criminals, or men on the margins of Texas society. The gang operated out of the Cross Timbers region of North Texas, a dense forest of oak and cedar that provided cover and made pursuit difficult. On February 23, 1878, the gang held up a Texas Central train at Allen Station, netting $1,300. On March 18th, they robbed another Texas Central train at Hutchins. On April 4th, They held up a Texas and Pacific train at Eagle Ford. On April 10th, they hit another Texas and Pacific train at Mesquite. None of these robberies netted significant amounts of money, and the gang's methods were described by witnesses as amateurish, suggesting that Bass and his men were either drunk or extremely nervous during the holdups. In one case, they missed a large stash of cash that an express messenger had hastily hidden. Despite the modest financial returns, the robberies generated enormous public outrage. 4 train holdups within 25 miles of Dallas, all in the span of 6 weeks, made headlines across Texas and the nation. Citizens demanded action. Politicians in Austin, the state capital, called for the restoration of law and order. The governor responded by ordering the Texas Rangers to pursue Bass and his gang at any cost. The Rangers were the state's paramilitary police force, established in the 1830s and reorganized after the Civil War. In 1878, the Rangers were still proving their value to a skeptical public that questioned whether the organization was necessary in a modern state. The pursuit of Sam Bass became a test case for the Rangers' effectiveness. A special company of Rangers, commanded by Captain Junius Peake, was assigned to hunt Bass. Peake and his men tracked the gang across North Texas through the spring and summer of 1878. The Rangers used informants, local knowledge, and relentless pursuit to close in on the Outlaws. One of Bass's gang members, Jim Murphy, became an informant. The circumstances of Murphy's recruitment as an informant are disputed. Some accounts claim that Rangers arrested Murphy's elderly father, who was seriously ill, and refused to allow him to see a doctor unless Murphy agreed to cooperate. Whether coercion or negotiation was involved, Murphy began feeding information to the Rangers about the gang's plans and movements. By July 1878, the Rangers knew that Bass was planning to rob a bank in Round Rock, Texas, a town about 20 miles north of Austin. On July 19, 1878, Bass and 3 other gang members, Frank Jackson, Seaborn Barnes, and Jim Murphy, rode into Round Rock to scout the bank and plan the robbery. They stopped at a general store to buy tobacco. Williamson County Deputy Sheriff A.W. Grimes happened to be in the store and noticed the men. Grimes and 2 other local lawmen, Deputy Sheriff Morris Moore and a man whose name is not clearly recorded in the sources, approached the gang members and asked them to surrender their firearms. It was not uncommon for lawmen in Texas towns to require visitors to check their weapons while in town, but the request triggered a gunfight. One of the gang members, likely Barnes, shot and killed Deputy Grimes. A chaotic exchange of gunfire erupted in the street. Texas Rangers, who had been waiting in Round Rock based on Murphy's intelligence, joined the fight. Ranger Sergeant Richard Ware shot Sam Bass. The bullet struck Bass in the back as he tried to flee. Barnes was killed in the street. Murphy escaped, having fulfilled his role as an informant. Frank Jackson helped Bass onto a horse, and the 2 rode out of Round Rock together. The Rangers and local lawmen pursued Bass and Jackson, but the fugitives managed to evade immediate capture. Bass, however, was severely wounded. He and Jackson rode a few miles north of Round Rock before Bass could go no farther. Jackson left him in a pasture and rode away, escaping. On the morning of July 20th, a posse led by Williamson County Deputy Sheriff James Milton Tucker was searching the area when they heard someone calling out. Sam Bass, lying in the grass, had called to the posse to identify himself. He said, "Hey, I'm over here. I'm Sam Bass, the one you are looking for." Tucker and the posse took Bass into custody and brought him back to Round Rock. A doctor examined him and determined that the wound was mortal. Bass refused to provide any information about the other members of his gang or about the buried gold from the Big Springs robbery. He told the Rangers, "It is against my profession to blow on my pals. If a man knows anything, he ought to die with it in him." Sam Bass died on the afternoon of July 21st, 1878, at 3:58, 27 years to the day after his birth. His last words, according to witnesses, were, "The world is bobbing around me. He was buried in the Round Rock Cemetery. His grave became a minor tourist attraction, visited by those who saw him as a folk hero and by those who saw him as a cautionary tale. A stone marker was placed over his grave with an epitaph that read, "A brave man reposes in death here. Why was he not true?" The question implied that Bass had squandered courage and ability on a life of crime when he might have achieved something worthwhile had he made different choices. It was a sentimental judgment, typical of Victorian-era moral certainty, but it captured the ambiguity that surrounded Bass's legacy. The Big Springs robbery and its aftermath reveal several patterns that defined crime and law enforcement in the American West during the 1870s. The first pattern is the role of the railroad in creating both opportunities for theft and mechanisms for pursuit. The transcontinental railroad concentrated vast amounts of wealth in moving targets that were difficult to defend. A single train could carry payrolls for mining companies, gold shipments from the San Francisco Mint, and cash for banks in eastern cities. These shipments were known to occur on regular schedules, and the trains stopped at predictable locations. For outlaws, the railroad was a conveyor belt of wealth passing through their territory. For law enforcement, the railroad provided telegraph lines that could summon help and rail cars that could transport posses quickly across hundreds of miles. The second pattern is the limited effectiveness of frontier law enforcement. The Big Springs robbery occurred in Nebraska, but the gang members escaped into Kansas, Missouri, and Texas, crossing jurisdictional boundaries that complicated pursuit. Sheriffs had authority only within their counties. State police forces like the Texas Rangers had authority only within their states. Federal marshals had broader jurisdiction, but they were few in number and could not respond quickly to crimes in remote locations. The U.S. Army could be mobilized, as it was in the pursuit of Collins and Heffridge, but the use of military force for domestic law enforcement was controversial and required coordination between civilian and military authorities. The result was a patchwork system that relied heavily on rewards, informants, and luck. The fact that 3 of the 6 robbers were killed within a month and a 4th died within 3 weeks suggests that the system worked, but it worked through violence and opportunism rather than systematic investigation. The third pattern is the role of celebrity in shaping the public's understanding of crime. Sam Bass became famous not because the Big Springs robbery was the largest train heist in Union Pacific history, though it was, but because he continued robbing trains after Big Springs and because his death in a gunfight with Texas Rangers provided a dramatic conclusion. Joel Collins, who planned the Big Springs robbery and led the gang, was killed quickly and forgotten quickly. His role was noted in newspaper accounts, but did not generate the ballads and dime novels that celebrated Bass. Jim Berry, who died slowly from gangrene, became a footnote. Tom Nixon and Jack Davis, who may have escaped with their shares of the loot, disappeared entirely from the historical record. Bass, by contrast, was lionized in songs and stories as a Robin Hood figure who robbed from the rich and gave to the poor, even though there is no evidence that he gave money to anyone except himself and his gang. The myth of Sam Bass tells us more about what audiences in the late 19th century wanted to believe about outlaws than it tells us about the actual man. The myth-making began almost immediately after Bass's death. A ballad called The Ballad of Sam Bass circulated in Texas within weeks, recounting his life and crimes in verses that exaggerated his generosity and downplayed his violence. The ballad claimed that Bass always gave to the poor, a detail unsupported by court records or eyewitness testimony. It also described him as a tragic figure betrayed by a friend, referring to Jim Murphy's role as an informant and casting Murphy as the villain of the story. The ballad ignored the fact that Bass killed at least one man, Deputy Sheriff A.W. Grimes, and participated in the murder of stage driver Johnny Slaughter. The sanitized version of Bass's life fit the narrative conventions of folk balladry, which required heroes and villains but could not tolerate moral complexity. The economic impact of the Big Springs robbery was significant in immediate terms, but negligible in the long term. The Union Pacific Railroad lost $60,000 in gold, a substantial sum, but the railroad was a massive corporation with revenues in the millions. The loss was absorbed, and insurance likely covered part of it. The individual passengers who lost money and watches were not compensated by the railroad, and for them, the loss was more personal. For the communities of Big Springs, Ogallala, and the other towns along the Union Pacific line, the robbery reinforced the perception that frontier life was dangerous and that law enforcement was inadequate. That perception contributed to political pressure for stronger state and federal intervention in criminal justice, which in turn led to the expansion of the Texas Rangers and similar forces in other states. The social consequences of the Big Springs robbery extended beyond the immediate participants. The robbery demonstrated that coordinated gangs could strike high-value targets and escape across state lines before law enforcement could respond effectively. This realization prompted railroads and express companies to invest more heavily in security. Armed guards became standard on trains carrying valuable cargo. Express car safes were redesigned with time locks and reinforced doors that were harder to open by force. Railroad detectives like E.M. Leach became a permanent fixture in the industry, employed full-time to investigate thefts and track down perpetrators. These changes did not eliminate train robberies, which continued into the early 20th century, but they made large-scale heists more difficult and less likely to succeed. The environmental context of the robbery is worth noting. Big Springs was located in a region that had been transformed by the railroad. Before 1867, when the Union Pacific laid tracks through the area, Big Springs was a watering hole on the emigrant trails, used by pioneers, the Pony Express, and before that, by indigenous peoples. The spring itself was a natural feature, fed by groundwater, and the cottonwood tree grew from the reliable water source. The railroad turned the spring into an industrial resource, using it to fill locomotive boilers. The station became a node in a network that spanned the continent. The robbery, in a sense, was a collision between two visions of the West. The railroad's vision of a managed, predictable, industrialized landscape, and the Outlaws' vision of the West as a place where men could take what they wanted and disappear into the vast, empty spaces that still remained beyond the reach of telegraphs and rail lines. By 1877, those empty spaces were shrinking rapidly. The Indian Wars were winding down. The Southern Plains tribes had been confined to reservations. The Northern Plains tribes, after the defeat at the Little Bighorn and the subsequent military campaigns, were being forced onto reservations as well. The Black Hills, where Collins and Bass had gone to prospect and where they had turned to robbing stagecoaches, had been seized from the Lakota despite treaties guaranteeing their ownership. The transformation was systematic and overwhelming. The railroad was both a tool and a symbol of that transformation. When the 6 outlaws robbed the Union Pacific train at Big Springs, they were not striking a blow against modernity or capitalism, though later mythologizers would sometimes portray it that way. They were stealing money because they needed money and because they thought they could get away with it. The fact that most of them did not get away with it, and that the one who became most famous died within a year, suggests that the frontier was closing faster than they realized. Jack Davis remains the most enigmatic figure in the story. After separating from Sam Bass in Texas, Davis vanished. Some accounts claim that Bass said Davis went to New Orleans, but Bass also lied about other things, and there is no corroboration. Davis may have changed his name and lived out his life in anonymity. He may have been killed in some unrelated incident and buried in an unmarked grave. He may have taken his $10,000 and invested it wisely, becoming a respectable citizen in a place where no one knew his history. The absence of information about Davis is frustrating for historians, but it is also a reminder that not every story has a cool, tidy resolution. The West was full of people who disappeared, either by choice or by circumstance, leaving no trace in the official record. The Big Springs robbery also had a technological dimension that is easy to overlook. The gold coins stolen from the train were newly minted at the San Francisco Mint, which means they were part of a system of currency production and distribution that relied on the railroad. The U.S. Mint in San Francisco had been established in 1854 to process gold from the California gold rush. By 1877, it was producing millions of dollars in gold coins annually, shipping them east to banks and treasury facilities. The coins were legal tender, backed by the federal government, and their movement across the country was a logistical operation that required security, coordination, and trust. When the Outlaws stole $60,000 in gold coins from the express car, they were disrupting a piece of the national monetary system. The coins themselves were fungible, meaning they could be spent anywhere without raising suspicion, which is why the Outlaws preferred gold to paper currency or other valuables. Gold was anonymous, portable, and universally accepted. The Union Pacific's response to the robbery was typical of the era. The company posted a $10,000 reward, hired detectives, and relied on local law enforcement to pursue the criminals. The company did not lobby for new federal laws or propose systemic changes to prevent future robberies. The robbery was treated as an isolated incident, a cost of doing business, rather than as evidence of a larger problem. This attitude would change over the next 2 decades as train robberies became more frequent and more audacious. By the 1890s, railroads were advocating for federal legislation that would make train robbery a federal crime, subject to federal prosecution and harsher penalties. The Big Springs robbery was part of the pattern that led to those changes, but in 1877 the legal framework for addressing train robbery was still ad hoc and reactive. The geographic scale of the manhunt is worth emphasizing. The Outlaws rode from Big Springs, Nebraska, through Kansas, Missouri, and into Texas, covering hundreds of miles on horseback. The posses that pursued them used horses, railroads, and telegraphs, but the vastness of the territory made tracking difficult. When Joel Collins and Bill Heffridge were killed at Buffalo Station, they were approximately 200 miles southwest of Big Springs. When Jim Berry died in Mexico, Missouri, he was nearly 600 miles east of Big Springs. When Sam Bass died in Round Rock, Texas, he was more than 800 miles south of Big Springs. The crime and its aftermath sprawled across 4 states and tens of thousands of square miles. That geographic dispersal was typical of frontier crime, and it helps explain why law enforcement was often ineffective. The newspapers played a crucial role in shaping the public narrative. The Giptian robbery was reported in papers from Omaha to New York, often with sensational headlines and vivid but inaccurate details. The amount stolen was sometimes exaggerated. The number of outlaws was sometimes inflated. The violence of the robbery was sometimes dramatized. These distortions were partly the result of poor communication, since telegraph reports from remote locations were often fragmentary, and partly the result of commercial incentives, since sensational stories sold papers. The newspaper coverage made Sam Bass a household name, but it also simplified and distorted the actual events. By the time Bass died, the legend had already diverged significantly from the reality. The question of what happened to the missing gold remains unresolved. Law enforcement recovered approximately $22,000 from the bodies of Collins, Heffridge, and Berry. If Tom Nixon and Jack Davis each escaped with $10,000, that accounts for $20,000 more. Sam Bass presumably had $10,000 when he returned to Texas, but by the time he died, he had spent it or hidden it. No cache of gold from the Big Springs robbery has ever been found, despite persistent rumors and treasure hunts over the decades. It is possible that Bass spent the money on gambling and living expenses during the 4 months between his return to Texas and his first train robbery in February 1878. It is also possible that he buried it somewhere in North Texas, intending to retrieve it later, and died before he could. The second possibility appeals to treasure hunters and storytellers, but the first is more consistent with Bass's documented behavior. On September 18, 1877, at 10:48 in the evening, 6 men stopped a train at a water station in Nebraska and stole $60,000 in gold. 147 years later, the details of that night remain vivid in the historical record. The red lantern hanging on the signal post, the masked men boarding the express car, the crates of gold coins packed in sawdust, the lone tree where the loot was divided. The robbery was the largest in Union Pacific history, a superlative that still holds. It was also the beginning of the end for the men who committed it. Within a month, 3 were dead. Within a year, 4 were dead. The 2 who may have survived did so by vanishing completely, which is its own kind of death. The Big Springs robbery was not the first train robbery in American history, nor the last, but it stands out for its scale and for the speed with which the gang was dismantled. The $60,000 in gold represented a fortune, but it could not buy safety or anonymity. The railroads, the telegraph, the rewards, and the relentless pursuit by lawmen made escape nearly impossible. The West was becoming too connected, too surveilled, too organized to accommodate men like Collins and Bass. They were born too late, in a sense, to succeed as outlaws. A generation earlier, they might have ridden into Mexico or the mountains and disappeared. By 1877, those options were closing. The same railroad that carried the gold also carried the news of its theft, and the same system that enabled the crime also ensured that most of the criminals would be caught or killed. In the end, the Big Springs robbery was a collision between ambition and reality. 6 men wanted money and freedom, and they planned a robbery that succeeded brilliantly in its execution. But they underestimated the speed and reach of the response, and they overestimated their ability to evade capture. The gold they stole was real, but the freedom it promised was an illusion. The West was no longer a place where a man could disappear. It was becoming a place where every crime left a trail, every telegraph carried a description, and every town had someone willing to inform on strangers for a reward. The Big Springs robbery marked the moment when the Old West collided with the New, and the New won decisively, not with a single dramatic confrontation, but with a grinding campaign of tracking, ambush, and attrition that left most of the robbers dead within months. The station at Big Springs still exists, though the town that grew up around it is small and quiet. The lone tree is gone. The spring that watered the locomotives still flows, though it is no longer used by trains. The site of the robbery is marked with a historical plaque that summarizes the events of September 18, 1877, in a few hundred words. Visitors who stop to read the plaque can look north across the prairie and imagine 6 men riding away in the darkness with sacks of gold, believing they had struck it rich. They had, for a moment, and then the moment ended, and the reckoning began, and the gold slipped through their hands like water.